So part two talks about or addresses the issue of problems versus conflicts. In some people's minds there's a distinction there, and so we'll go through a definition of each. We'll also touch on the types of conflicts that typically occur both in personal and in business, and what are some of the common characteristics that apply generally. And then finally we'll introduce an example of a dilemma conflict. So in terms of definitions, you can see here that a problem is defined as a matter or situation regarded as unwelcome or harmful and in need of action. So not a complex definition, but one that I think most of us would be familiar with. Conversely, a conflict is seen as a disagreement or argument that may be ongoing or temporary. So when we compare these two definitions, one seems to represent a static situation, whereas the conflict tends to appear that there's action involved, through the disagreement or argument itself. But in any event, from the point of view of this course, it's not relevant. The distinction, it may be important in some areas, but certainly in terms of what I'm about to go through, that distinction is largely irrelevant. So what are the types of problems or conflicts? Well, there are the mathematical puzzles and quizzes, and right up front I want to note that this course doesn't address those particular types of problems. But it does address dilemmas of choice. Should we do A or should we do B? And that can also represent itself as a question of prioritisation of resources. So should we allocate resources to project A, then B, then C, or should it be B, C and A? And we can have very many variations on the theme of where to prioritise resources. And the third type is the chronic or enduring compromise, where we do things as a matter of course, not realising that underlying that approach is an inherent conflict, which is represented in terms of a compromise. So an example that I give here is where approval authorisation on all invoices is required in a business. It happens all the time, and yet the process has been going on for years without anyone thinking about whether in fact this is necessary. So those that work in the process look at it and may be even frustrated by it because of delays associated with getting that approval, and no one's really looked at that process and say, do we need to treat an invoice for $10 as in the same way as we do for one for $10,000. So that type of conflict also can be covered by this solution or this approach. So we're going to focus on the dilemma of choice as an example because it'll allow us to go through the method in a way that it'll be familiar to most. So what are some of the typical characteristics of problem or conflict situations? Well, I've listed 6 of them here as the ones that are probably most noteworthy. The first being that conflicts occur when it's not apparent how to solve a given situation or dilemma. So we all know this to be true, that it might be that there is a solution available, but the parties involved in the conflict aren't aware of how that or what that solution might look like. So the conflict occurs simply through that lack of knowledge. Secondly, it's not always clear that resolution is the desired outcome. So there may be 2 parties involved in a conflict, and indeed it might be one or more of those that really don't want that conflict to resolve itself. And I'm sure we can think of some examples of where that might be the case in a political sense, where governments allow conflicts to continue to exist for one reason or another, which may not be apparent to those that are involved in the conflict. The third is there's a tendency to focus on the different points of view rather than on the common objective. So how often is it that we find that the conflict actually arises because both might agree on a common point of view, but the method of achieving that objective is in conflict. But by reminding both parties of what the common objective is, we go a long way to solving the issue and keeping people's perspective on what the goal is. The fourth type of or characteristic is where each party assumes there is no misunderstanding in the language. So where there's a term used in a conflict and that term can have more than one meaning, often the conflict can be resolved by simply going back and saying, well, what do you mean by that word? And through that you discover that that's where the real conflict occurs. In the fifth characteristic, I talk about conflicts seen as a personal issue rather than a third party issue. So often we personalise conflicts because it might be expressed by a person, but he or she may indeed be expressing a point of view that they've heard elsewhere. But we tend to personalise it when in fact the conflict would be seen and there would be less passion involved if we realised or thought of it in terms of a point of view that is a third party to the discussion. So you and I might be arguing, but we're arguing about a subject that is separate to ourselves. And sixth, finally, is the significant effort is applied to solution mode rather than problem definition mode. So again, how often do we find ourselves in conflicts where one or more of the parties is always proposing a solution, but not as much effort or nowhere near the effort is applied to what really is the problem, what's the root cause of this problem. And often by failing to do that, none of these solutions will be enduring. So I'm going to use an example because it's always easier to explain concepts through the use of an example. And it's trivial and typical, but it's been presented in order to help explain the method, and really the focus shouldn't be so much on the problem but the approach that I use as we apply evaporating cloud method to problem solving. And also the problem you'll note is both personal and business related, and really the reason I chose that was to give you an ability to see how this method can be universally applied under different circumstances. So what's the scenario? The problem or conflict that I've chosen is this one around who should pay for the marketing costs when a person is selling a house. So typically when using a real estate agent to sell a house, it's often the case when the agent will charge a commission, which is typically a percentage of the sale price, for his or her services, as well as ask for additional funds to cover the cost of marketing. This isn't always the case, but it can be and often is the case. And the cost of that marketing is to cover brochures and picture taking and video development, floor plans, promotional material, flyers and so on. From the agent's point of view, these costs are a necessary and increasingly costly part of selling a house, which needs to be paid for by the principal or the owner. The house owner, on the other hand, would argue that the marketing the house is a fundamental part of the job of the agent, and therefore marketing costs should be seen as a cost of business offset against a sizable agency commission. So consequently, the house owner would argue that the marketing cost should be paid by the real estate agent. So here we have the dilemma. The agent believes it should be paid for by a house owner, and the house owner believes it should be paid for by the agent. Let's now move forward and talk about the evaporating cloud method in part 3.